Hi, everyone. Welcome to this WSP webinar. My name is Kendra Mulhern. I am part of the global marketing team here at WSP, and I'll be moderating today's call. We'll start off with a few logistics. For the presentation, your microphone has automatically been muted. However, you're welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation. To ask a question, please type it into the question section on the right side of the webinar control panel. We've allotted time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So to start off with, we would love to kick things off by asking, what are the key questions that you would like answered today? If you could add your response using the questions pane, that would be terrific. So the goal of today's webinar is to help you gain a better understanding of how the discussions at COP27 may impact regions and market sectors. We've assembled a stellar global panel representing many of our sectors and regions all over the world. Each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes on their perspectives. Then our panelists will come together for a discussion. Finally, I'll read through as many of your questions as we can, and they'll answer them. So let's get going. I'll turn things over to David Simons, our Future Ready Global Leader, and he's based in the UK. Over to you, David.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and yeah, nice to be with you. It's great to be talking to a global audience this afternoon or this morning if you're in North America. So hello. Three things I'd like just to start with to provide the overall context. First of all, let's celebrate that we've got an agreement at the end of 2 weeks of fairly fraught negotiation. Secondly, regardless of the implementation of the agreement, implementation is the absolute key thing that is most important. And thirdly, while much of the focus of the last 2 weeks has been on governments, it is as important that business and cities and other organisations all have robust climate plans as well. So let's just unpack and talk very briefly about each of those for my three key takeaways. First of all, let's celebrate the fact that we have an agreement. It's never exactly what everybody wants, but we've made progress in the agreement. Especially, we've made progress on resilience and adaptation to climate change. There's some more that you will hear in this in this session about the Sharm El Sheikh adaptation agenda that we've as WSP have been quite closely involved with through Peter Hall. You'll hear more about the loss and damage agreement that we have got, with lots more details to work through. I think the thing that we find is probably a bit disappointing is that it is weaker on climate mitigation. At the end of COP26, one of the rallying things that member states were asked to do is to come back with beefed up things called nationally determined contributions. Relatively few, around about only 29 countries came back with those beefed up climate commitments. We are a long way from having, if you add that lot up, to be meeting greenhouse gas goals to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But regardless of that, my point too is that COP26 in Glasgow with the Glasgow Climate Pact, the many arrangements and agreements, which you will hear a little bit more about today, many of them are very ambitious, and many of them actually also led by the private sector as well. If I go back to COP26 last year, you've got the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use that committed to halting deforestation. You've got other really eye-catching commitments, such as the Methane Pledge, to cut emissions by 30% by 2030. These are big commitments, and the key thing is to be getting on with implementing it. We've got a good number of you who are joining from the UK. A lot of the work and a lot of the modelling that we are doing for our UK clients at the moment is really thinking about how do emissions fit into those 5-year carbon budgets that the Committee on Climate Change has set. Carbon Budget 6, covering 2032 to 2037, is really challenging. It is a very, very big decline from where we are today to meet that carbon budget 6. And that is going to require a very, very substantial amount of implementation by governments in their policies for industry, for transport, for buildings and the like. And then around that, my third point is then that so much, as I've said, around climate action at COP26 focuses on what governments are doing and what governments are signing up to. But also around COP27, there was a very, very important report from the UN called Integrity Matters. And that really highlighted the imperative for the private sector and for cities to have strong targets, especially if we're talking about 1.5 degrees, that's halving carbon emissions by 2030, but not just to have that target, is to have a plan to deliver that. Because if we don't have a plan, then frankly, 8 years will come at us like a train, and we will find ourselves as business as culpable as not helped for missing climate targets as government aspiration as well. And let's just be clear in that. Net zero is not the same as carbon neutral. That's an important principle. Halving carbon emissions is halving absolute carbon emissions across both direct operations and value chain. And that's a very, very big challenge for all. So those are my three key takeaways. Let me now just keep some interest and let me just launch a poll for you. We're going to have a series of quick fire polls through the event, and just to ask you, what is the biggest challenge to decarbonising your company or your organisation? And we'll just give you 10 to 20 seconds just to answer these. We'll throw the results up and then I'll pass over to Peter Hall. Okay, thank you. Let's just have a quick look at the results if we can. Okay, very interesting indeed. So thank you, that's useful to see. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's a pleasure to join the call today and give some perspectives from being at COP27 for both weeks, and also having been at COP26. It's interesting from coming off of COP26, where there was a recognition that in a 1.5 C world, you're still going to have upwards of 3.8 billion people exposed to routine climate risks and shocks, and that was one of the takeaways from COP26. And for me, it was actually pretty exciting to see the progress that was made in the year leading up to COP27. And one of the key things I think we're seeing is that the Egypt COP really put adaptation as a pillar of the COP presidency, and it was really prevalent in a lot of the discussions. And one of the things we also saw is, it's really squarely in the agenda and action. So both net zero and the race to resilience equally together, and a lot of discussion and panels and outputs at COP27 on a just transition and addressing the needs of populations and countries that are facing climate shocks most directly. One of the things I think that was interesting, I think I just saw that this is probably the second largest COP ever, over 30,000 people in attendance, a large number of private sectors, cities, states, and regions attended. I think it was probably the largest number of pavilions at a COP, a big presence from the financial sector and the private sector as well. And so that was interesting, and I definitely saw that although everyone is working towards similar goals, there still needs to be a lot more connection of companies around the solutions. Probably one of the biggest takeaways that I had, and this is work that I've supported through WSP, through my secondment to the Climate Champions team, was the release of the Sharm El Sheikh adaptation agenda, which actually was announced on the first day of the COP presidency and UNFCCC, and also made it into the final implementation plan. It is the first comprehensive global plan to really rally states and NSAs behind a set of 30 adaptation outcomes. So these are outcomes that are needed to protect people in a 1.5 C world. And of course, a lot of the projections are looking at things higher than that. And what we've done is organized, much like SBTI, but targets around resilience and adaptation around food and ag, water and nature, oceans and coastal systems, human settlements, and then infrastructure systems as a way to really elevate action. So this work was developed in collaboration with over 2,000 organizations, 131 countries. It was driven by the Race to Resilience campaign that I'm part of in the Climate Champions team. And really by driving around these 30 outcomes, it really is probably the first comprehensive global plan to rally government, and non-government actors around adaptation actions, recognizing this has to be done. We have to have targets and pull on the same thread across all these organizations. It was really interesting also for me to see at this COP that nature, I think this is the first time that a COP cover decision included nature-based solutions in it, and there was also a section in the final outcome on early warning systems. I think about a third of the world doesn't have early warning systems. So a lot of tactical pieces were put into this, which was interesting. It's also the first water day at a climate COP. And then it supported, I think, 4 or 5 implementation labs. And those are also new for a COP, where there was specific sections where they're looking at how companies can implement projects and programs related to the adaptation agenda. Some of the other things, I think the elevation of the Global South, a lot of initiatives such as the African carbon market. There was a really interesting African insurance pledge, a $14 billion pledge for that. A lot of city engagement were there. So a lot of presence from Africa, which is great to see. And then I think power of partnerships. So a big stress on partnerships, how companies and private sector and public sector have to work together. And then I encourage everyone to look at the organization I work for. Nigel Topping had a great closing talking about a stock take, where we're actually at, how we need to really drive. There's a lot of hope around these plans, and then radical collaboration to really line up around breakthroughs. So for me, it was a very interesting and productive COP, and it's great to share the insights with you. And I guess for me, launching into the next poll is, and this relates to resilience because it directly affects how much adaptation we're going to have to drive, is how optimistic are people that we're going to actually limit global warming to 1.5?
Thanks very much, Peter. And just a reminder to everybody, to launch the polls, you need to minimize your screen so that you're not in full screen mode, and then you can take part in the polls. We'll just give it another minute here. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, and that's also equally interesting and probably reflects a lot of the sentiment at COP, with the majority of people disagreeing that we're going to make 1.5. And now what, I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Next area of focus will be climate adaptation and resilience. And always being more of a glass half full kind of person, I would like to first do a bit of context setting. Despite some understandable disappointment about the final COP27 agreement not going far enough, let's take a moment to recognize how far we have come on climate action. 20 years ago, we were on a path for 4 degrees Celsius of global warming, the catastrophic consequences of that much global warming being almost unimaginable. Today, we are on a trajectory toward less than 3 degrees of warming. And with this more hopeful sentiment that was so evident across much of COP27, there are also many opportunities that were discussed, especially for business and the greater private sector. Greater focus on solutions involving considerations like energy efficiency, circularity, life cycle costs and impacts must play a key role if we are to have any chance to achieve the 1.5 degree ambition. But technological innovation that helps us achieve more sustainable, scalable, future-ready solutions must also play a huge role. This includes accelerating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and the use of renewable energy sources, which is an industry that now employs more people than the fossil fuel industry and now has lower comparative costs due to rapid technology improvements and deployment at scale. Likewise, as Peter mentioned, nature-based solutions were discussed, and carbon dioxide removal and other green solutions are playing a bigger and bigger role. In fact, I personally facilitated a session on nature-based solutions, talked about things like living breakwaters, living shorelines, green streets, sustainable agriculture, green buildings, and green urban development. This being a perfect lead-in to the United Nations Biodiversity Conference known as COP27, which will take place in Montreal in a few weeks, very near to WSP's corporate headquarters. A bit younger and a bit smaller than the annual UN climate conferences, this will be the 15th meeting of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Similar to the climate COPs, these biodiversity COPs bring together countries to agree on targets to ensure the survival of species and stem the collapse of ecosystems across the world. But more and more, they also include private sector participation. And like COP27, COP15 will also include substantial WSP participation. With regard to the ongoing climate change impacts and back to context setting, we are already at just over 1 degree of global warming, with devastating impacts already occurring. These impacts are disproportionately being felt by the poorer nations of the global south, whereas the wealthier nations of the global north, and especially the United States, have been responsible for the most greenhouse gas emissions by far. This gave rise to the very important, highly publicized loss and damage funding components in the final COP27 deal. To give you a sense for the scale of this issue already, a report by 55 vulnerable countries estimated their combined climate-linked losses over the last 2 decades totaled $525 billion, or 20% of their collective GDP. But there are a lot of details yet to be worked out, and it will take time. For example, what are the specific sources and timing of loss and damage funds? Also, will the covered losses and damages include damaged ecosystems, cultural assets, private property, as opposed to just being limited to public infrastructure? This is also why climate adaptation and resilience has become such a prominent theme for the first time and increasingly over the last 2 COPs. Climate loss and damage and climate adaptation resilience are really 2 sides of the same coin when it comes to the reality that no matter how ambitious we might be in reducing greenhouse gas levels, we have already locked in so much global warming that we cannot wait to address the devastating impacts through greenhouse gas reductions alone. In other words, we need to avoid the false choices of focusing on either climate mitigation or on climate adaptation and resilience. We must do both with equal urgency by preparing better for the ongoing impacts of climate change and building back smarter and when related devastation does occur. Lastly, and tying most directly into the business opportunity theme, the private sector showed up in a bigger way than ever before at COP27. Governments cannot fund or do what needs to be done on their own, and this has now been recognized with many delegations, meetings, sessions, presentations, and pavilions focused in whole or in part on industrial and technology solutions of all kinds, private finance community coming together consisting of the investors, bankers, insurers, climate-focused consulting community from the big 4 accounting firms and global management consultancies also being present in a huge way. Comparatively speaking, the engineering and environmental consulting sector that we're a part of was less broadly represented, and we hope to see that improved in the future as an industry at large. It really has a lot of credibility and a lot of value to be provided when it comes to climate action. So thank you, and now we'll go to the next poll. For this poll, what is the biggest challenge to building resilience to climate impacts for your company?
Thanks, Tom. We'll just give it a few seconds here for people to reply. And again, need to minimize your screen so that you're not in full screen mode to be able to do so. Just give it a couple seconds. There we go. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, very interesting that business case is more of a factor on the answer to this question than the earlier survey poll. So very helpful. Thank you.
That's great. And we'll turn it over to Stacy.
There, perfect. All right, can you hear me? Yes. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about key takeaways on the topic of climate and finance, or climate finance. So the first thing I'll say, and just picking up from what Tom mentioned, this COP had more participation by more private sector stakeholders than ever before, and that includes not just business and industry, but also the financial sector. So what was clear kind of walking around the halls of this year's COP was that climate is now becoming kind of the biggest investment opportunity of a lifetime. And it's not just kind of through the lens of risk. For the last few years, there's been a feeling that climate investment has been a matter of risk management, and on the backs of kind of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the financial sector and investors in particular were really trying to get their hands around the risk side of things. But this year you saw kind of a palpable shift, I would say, from kind of the conversation around financing climate investments from being a risk management one, how do I reduce my kind of exposure to climate-related risks from a financial perspective, into the opportunity set. And that has been something that was pretty interesting, and I have to say kind of gives me a little bit of hope, because I think when investors start to pivot and focus on the opportunity set and start to think about this as an offensive undertaking as opposed to a defensive undertaking, things will shift and move pretty quickly. In the context of that, there was a lot of discussion about global headwinds. There was discussion about the energy crisis, the Ukraine war, whether there was a climate investment was going to slow down because of energy prices. Certainly inflation was on the minds of just about everybody who were thinking about kind of climate and investment. And of course, from the perspective of developing countries and a more kind of broader set of stakeholders, including countries, the inflation plus strong dollar circumstance that we have now was really kind of an important theme for those who were thinking about how to finance and what ways we could make finance easier and more accessible for developing countries. Obviously, with a strong dollar, certain developing countries' debt becomes a little less sustainable, and so you have those kind of headwinds kind of coming at you if you're a developing country. But that is kind of a broad kind of context setting. So on the one hand, you've got, investors who were saying, yeah, actually, like, I'm ready to kind of, I see this as an investment opportunity and I'm ready to go on offense. And notwithstanding kind of the global headwinds and the, and inflation and the strong dollar for emerging markets, what does that mean? And that leads to the second point I have, which was this really interesting discussion about whether, we're at a moment of climate investment that's industry driven. Clearly, there's enough appetite and willingness and eagerness from the financial sector to start investing in decarbonization, to start investing in adaptation and resilience. But the combination of that with what people were framing as industrial policy, the question on the mind of a lot of finance stakeholders and panelists was, are we in a moment where the policy signals and the framing that policy has done to give us a direction of travel is helping us, accelerate this opportunity set? And on that note, a number of people identified in the United States the Inflation Reduction Act as being a really important policy lever to start driving investment in climate change. And the Inflation Reduction Act was also a piece of policy that was pretty deep in terms of incentives. So a lot less of the stick and a lot more of the carrot through that policy. And investors were very excited about the potential that the Inflation Reduction Act would have in terms of driving their ability to invest in climate positive things. The other kind of macro thing that I was hearing at COP through the financial sector and through investors was this idea that, this really is investing in climate, either decarbonization or resilience or both, really is a matter of reorganizing competitiveness. And if you are a company or an industry or an asset that is stuck in kind of an old way of thinking about how you're going to be competitive, particularly if you are kind of grounded on a fossil-based kind of system, you're maybe going to miss the boat. So this idea that we are kind of reorganizing what competitiveness means for the next generation was definitely another theme that you heard coming through some of the panelists. And then the financial sector seems incredibly ready to finance this. A couple of more specific things that came out of COP that were pretty important from a financial sector perspective. Obviously, a number of people have heard about the loss and damage fund. That is something that will that will be very important for the most vulnerable most climate vulnerable countries. So we'll see how that kind of comes about in the next year. And then, of course, a couple of other things to watch: the Bridgetown Initiative. The Bridgetown Initiative is an initiative that will help increasingly distressed emerging markets get relief in exchange for climate investment, and here the IMF will be a key player. And one thing I'll call out, perhaps the most significant and least controversial thing that came out of COP was a global methane pledge. We've got more than 150 countries that have signed up to invest more than $20 billion in the reduction of methane, which is a pretty potent greenhouse gas. There is investment opportunity there immediately, and a lot of money that will be flowing to that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kendra.
Thank you. Sorry to jump in there, Stacy.
And another poll. Here we go.
Here we
so
go.
Do you want to take the honors, Kendra?
Sure. So everyone should see that pop up on their screen. And again, if you minimize full screen mode to be able to reply to that poll, that would be terrific. Do you have a plan to report on TCFD or other climate risk standards? We have a few options there. Of course, we're tracking behind in our timing here, so I'm going to move it along pretty quickly. I'm going to close it in just a second.
Kendra, I'd also note that finance was coming up as one of the top issues in the prior polls, the biggest challenge to decarbonization, and one of the biggest challenges to building resilience. So.
And there we go. Can you see the replies there, Stacy?
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting. That's great.
Okay, and now turning it over to Lawrence.
Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Greetings from Montreal. Maybe this, a lot of the points, important points about the event were covered. So maybe just a little bit more of a personal perspective. As a former climate negotiator, I was a negotiator for Government of Canada for several years at some pretty significant prior COPs. You know, I think what I saw and heard this COP compared to before, as others have noted, much more presence of sort of the non-governmental kind of sector, people there not to participate as negotiators, but to participate in discussions around solutions, trying to identify risks and opportunities to address. You know, in the past, when I was negotiating, the COPs were a lot about the official process. Yes, there was the kind of the side events and the activities, but the level of energy that I saw in Egypt from everybody else that wasn't there to negotiate was really incredible and gave me a lot of hope. You know, the negotiations, I think, were, they resulted in an outcome, and as David noted, it's great that there was an outcome. I think there could have been perhaps some stronger outcomes, and I think where we did see outcomes, for example, in the loss and damage fund, which was something that I'll be honest, I never would have expected that to be adopted. So that was an important victory, I think, for the presidency and for developing countries. But it's still going to be some time to get that up and running, just given how long the official process takes. Having said that, as I said, there was so much else going on, and the sort of the recognition that this is an issue that's relevant today for cities, for companies, for financial institutions, for various stakeholders, and not something I need to worry about, in the future, I think was really came through. As a solutions company, WSP really is thinking about, not only how do we implement our own targets. One of the companies that has an approved science-based target, which is a real statement of our commitment to climate action. And how do we integrate climate into all the solutions that we offer? I mean, it's core to our future ready approach, looking at climate as an important driver of how we design projects, how we give advice. And I'd say that's probably true for everybody on this, in our audience today. It's really important to think about how do you integrate climate into everything you do, your strategy, your operations, your governance, your risk management techniques, the targets that you set for yourself. Just a little point maybe about from a Canadian, the Canadian vantage point for the Canadians on the call today. You know, the government of Canada has been criticized over the years for its policies and ambition, and I have to say, you know, I was impressed by Minister Guilbeault and the way he was communicating to people at the COP. Very frank and honest assessment of the successes that the government of Canada has had in advancing climate action, but also the challenges that remain to be addressed as Canada looks to implement its sort of 2030 plan and its 2050 net zero target. And obviously also resilience is a really big issue for Canada too. There is, however, really great news from a Canadian leadership perspective. Some of you may have seen the World Benchmarking Alliance's recent report that highlighted a number of Canadian financial institutions as world leaders. BMO was I think ranked #1 across all categories for their sustainability approach, and CDPQ, which also happens to be WSP's top shareholder, was ranked #1 in the world in the pension fund category for its commitment to sustainability. So it's really exciting to see that kind of leadership happening in Canada in the financial sector, and clearly across the corporate sector more broadly. And it again sort of showcases that yes, government policy is critical to setting the framework and implementing targets, but there's so much that other actors can do, and you know, just stepping up and showing leadership is something we're increasingly seeing more and more from all kinds of actors across civil society, and that's really what gave me hope coming out of this COP. I think we may have a bit of another poll.
We do.
All right, so what is the largest driver of climate action for your company?
And this is the last poll. So we'll just give it a few seconds here for people to reply. Thanks very much for everybody's input. Give it one more second. You can see lots of people are replying. Thanks so much. And I'm going to close it out, everybody, and share so we can move on to Amanda.
Very interesting. So it proves, and it doesn't it, that what we've been sort of talking about, that how yes, policy is critically important, but the wider market is really changing its point of view on this, and you know, and the values point that's there is really important too. So you know, thank you for your answers. Really interesting outcome result. Amanda, over to you.
Thanks, Lawrence. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm presenting today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, who are Australia's first engineers and scientists. I honour their ongoing spiritual relationship with country and continuing connection to culture, community, land, sea and sky, and I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. So Australia and our Pacific neighbours are some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and yet the targets that Australia has set at COP27 are still some of the weakest in the developed world. Australia's emissions reduction target has increased from 26%, which was set under the Scott Morrison government, to now 43% reduction by 2030. And we've finally set a net zero target by 2050. But if you compare this to our neighbours in New Zealand, who have a target of 50% reduction by 2030, or the UK that has a 63% reduction by 2030, you can tell that there's a big gap between our targets and some of our neighbours. So Australia's still one of the top global exporters of coal and gas, ranking 3 only behind Russia and Saudi Arabia, and there's currently no commitment to ending new fossil fuel projects or halting the expansion of existing ones. There are currently still over 100 fossil fuel developments in the pipeline. It should be noted that Australia did not sign the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, which was supported by Canada, the UK, and the US. This partnership was calling to direct subsidies away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy by this year's end. Australia has put in a bid to host COP31 with Pacific nations as a co-host, and the Pacific nations led by Vanuatu are using this as an opportunity to negotiate with Australia and really use this as a leverage to encourage Australia to stop subsidising new fuel developments and to secure their support to host COP31 by in 2026. So what does this actually mean for our clients? So I should say the Australian sustainability team works across a variety of industries. We work in transport, infrastructure, and the building sectors, as well as the mining and extractive industries. And we really do help our clients decarbonize and electrify their businesses. So that's from working on anything from sustainable ports to rail decarbonisation to electrification of hospitals and buses with local and state governments. So we've been doing a lot of work as well on climate change resilience with our communities, especially in the aftermath of the floods that were experienced in the east coast of Australia this year. So for the purpose of this update, I'm going to focus specifically on the mining and resource sector, which is a key source of income for Australia. In 2020, export from mining generated approximately 200 billion USD of revenue for the Australian economy. So far, we've really seen Australia wearing the title of a heavyweight in the fossil fuel industries, but we have such a great opportunity right now to become a renewable energy superpower. So I see this happening in three specific ways: decarbonisation, divestment, and diversification. So in terms of decarbonisation, I should say straight off the bat, there's no pathway to net zero without addressing the vast issue of biodiversity loss that we're experiencing. Mining companies are already doing all they can to work on decarbonising their operations and electrifying their operations, but we should also be looking at developing carbon and biodiversity net gain projects on land and assets, and this has the real potential of creating a wealth of community and biodiversity co-benefits. In terms of divestment, pure pressure is coming in obviously from trading partners who have net zero targets, and as Stacey mentioned, there's a real risk if we're not jumping on that now at an early stage to optimize ourselves away from a very fossil fuel heavy industry and economy. So obviously there's an increase in mandatory reporting, both TCFD and TNFD, which is coming out probably early 2023. And this means more scrutiny as investors are looking to understand the long-term impacts of their investment. The problem is, however, divesting from a mine site that is fossil fuel heavy doesn't necessarily decrease global emissions if that mine site is still operational. So we need to decarbonize these mine sites to decrease output and eventually close down the site altogether. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. In terms of diversification, we have a real push, obviously, globally towards renewable energy, which obviously requires batteries for storage, solar PVs, wind turbines, and all of this requires materials and minerals to be produced. Australia has a real abundance of minerals and resources required to electrify and decarbonise the economies. Annual demand for materials will be exceeding over 700 million tonnes by 2050, and Australia is well placed to jump on this as an opportunity and become part of the solution. The opportunity lies in pivoting to mine lower carbon intensive products such as copper, nickel, lithium, and cobalt. So how does natural capital and sustainable finance play into this? Natural capital and sustainable finance can provide new income streams for clients looking to divest from carbon intensive practices. Clients can avoid stranded assets on their books and the negative impacts this obviously causes to communities by looking towards sustainable finance models and mechanisms to optimize these sites for alternative revenue streams. Something as simple as conducting a natural capital valuation on your site can really help you identify other ecosystem services that are being provided, can help you start working with local communities to develop nature-based solutions, and these can generate greater income and create a thriving alternative economy. So that's my overview, and I'm just gonna, I think, hand over to Sophie. I don't think there's another poll.
Yep, you're right, Amanda. Okay. Thanks very much.
Over to you, Sophie.
Okay, Sophia may be having some technical difficulties. So maybe we can start by answering some of the questions that have popped up instead here, because there are a super abundance of them. So if everyone is able to, who's left on the call, to turn on their cameras, please. And Sophia, if you're there, feel free to speak up. We'll just pop to some of the questions as I pull some up here. And you know what, Stacy, there are some really interesting questions here as far as the climate finance goes. And about with regard to the loss and damage agreement, does it specify what country contributions will be?
No.
Does the loss and damage agreement specify the types of adaptation solutions that will be funded?
Yeah, no, and I think the devil is going to be in the details. There will be a transition committee, and the transition committee will have the luxury, pleasure, and obligation to define some of those things. I think, you know, what's financed, how it's financed, who is financed. I think the who is financed is a big question too, because the loss and damage idea is really for the most vulnerable, most climate vulnerable countries. That's one kind of category. How it's capitalized is also another kind of bucket of questions. And in fact, kind of as David mentioned in his opening remarks, you know, one of the outcomes of the COP was the loss and damage fund, but the other outcome that was not achieved was language around all fossil fuels. And I believe that there will be a discussion in the context of loss and damage around the contributors to that fund coming from a broader range of donor countries, including those countries who are heavy exporters of fossil fuels. So much to be decided. The transition committee this next year will have the pleasure of doing that. Because it's in a UNFCCC text, it will be an official process, so it should be transparent enough to follow. But no, none of those details are yet to be determined.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate you stepping up there and everybody coming back on screen. I did see Sophia there for a second, but she may still be having issues. I know that
Stacy, I'm here. Yeah.
You are there? Oh, fantastic.
Yes.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you then, Sophia. Thanks very much.
Hi, everybody. Apologies, I'm experiencing a little bit of internet issues here. I hope you can hear me. So I'd like to discuss kind of more around the properties and buildings in terms of our built environment stock and how COP27 has given us some key outcomes in terms of obviously having loss and damage financial assistance is being put in place. This could take a while. However, we're responsible to ensure all future damage is mitigated with resilient built environments. So obviously we're trying to avoid any of this extreme events and issues happening in terms of making sure that we keep awareness of passive and active retrofit measures for all buildings to a range of climate impacts, and also making sure that we have you know, climate risk analysis done on the majority of our projects, so it's understanding projected future weather data and designing our environments accordingly, so that we don't have to do this kind of repairing in the future. We should be ready, and we have such an abundance of tools available to us in terms of simulation methods, data, that we can really analyze and hone down to kind of understand each project site location. And this is one thing that we do as a business for all of our projects, is we do an initial study to assess, you know, what's going to happen in the next 100 years. And it's incredibly valuable, actually, because we can look at kind of any design measures, anything that needs to be incorporated within the base design, right from the initial concept of our projects all the way through to delivery. And you know, I think this is a key element in terms of achieving the 1.5 goal, because we have such great tools available to us in terms of modeling. We can model up to 1,000 iterations of a building and see how it will respond and react and perform within the environment before we even start constructing. And I think there's, you know, such an important onus on building performance analysis. and ensuring that building performance analysis is incorporated with all of the decision-making milestones. So, you know, it's not just cost and aesthetics that we need to consider, it's also how is this design going to perform? And optimizing energy, you know, in terms of decarbonisation, we don't want to just be offsetting with renewables. We want to be designing, constructing and delivering a very well-performing building. And I think that's key for us in the Middle East within WSP, is that our engineers are very well informed in terms of understanding our carbon, in terms of choosing materials, guiding our clients, but also in terms of performance. And again, my final point really is around the fossil fuel agreements that are still in tally with the COP26. So we haven't really moved further. However, I think what's really important is that we ensure we do the best thing. Now, not just because it's mandated or not just because our clients want us to, but it's because we know that that's the best thing for us as a business, and that allows us to attract the best talent within our properties and buildings unit. So thank you. What I will do now, I'm aware we're a bit short on time. I will move over to some questions from our very talented WSP esteemed colleagues here. So David, I'd like to fire this one over to you. How does the COP process hold the private sector to account?
It's an interesting question, Sophia. I mean, look, I think I look at it in two ways. There are many commitments that are made by the private sector in and around COP, which are very relevant, and many are, to be honest with you, voluntary. But I think that's completely by the by, frankly. I mean, you know, we've heard from all of our speakers today, from Stacey talking about the financial sector, just through to, you know, the opportunities that WSP is seeing and we're seeing with our clients, that you know, the role of business and the role of leadership is to plan your business for the long term. And if you can't see that net zero and indeed increased weather extremes from climate change is a material issue for your business, then yeah, well, bet your sink on it, because you know you might make a lot of money, but the vast majority of people are seeing completely the opposite way. And I would guess if you're on the call, you would see that as well. Climate, as Stacey has said, is the opportunity of the next century. We know from the poll that our clients and your customers, this is one of their key drivers for you. So it's take advantage of it, spot and deliver on it at a strategic level to make the most of the growth opportunities that climate represents, and also minimize the downside.
Fantastic. Thank you for your thoughts, David. I'd like to move this over to Lawrence next. How should companies think about this 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius temperature goal for their businesses and assets? And how do we move from targets to implementation?
It's a great question. And maybe as a framing comment, it maybe builds a bit also on what David was pointing to. I mean, the agreements really are, the official process, if you think about it, is establishes the floor but not the ceiling, right? So you can always be more ambitious as a firm, as an individual, as a community, than the minimum standards that are set by the international process. And so, going to your point, I mean, generally speaking, I think you want to aim for a 1.5 degree aligned target in terms of your mitigation, right? Be as ambitious as possible, you know, in terms of reducing your own emissions. I think that goes to what we were talking about earlier, market requests, obviously the policy that's being set up. Really important, you spoke of this, Sophia, attracting employees. Increasingly, people want to be working for companies that are in line with that kind of commitment.
Absolutely.
But in terms of your resilience, though, think of a 4 degree world. Think of a world where, you know, things don't go as well as we would all hope, and therefore, what is it you need to protect yourself? What are the risks you need to manage against? So, you know, to protect against transition risk, to be positioned in the market, aim for 1.5 degrees for your own emissions. To think about what you could be exposed to, think about a world that's on a 4 degree pathway in terms of your scenarios as you're looking ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting actually, because it's this kind of global awareness now that's coming more to the forefronts of people's minds. It's every stakeholder. It's not just one component.
Yeah, and I think we may have lost you, Sophia, for a sec, but just to continue on the second part of your question around targets, I would almost think of it as a journey rather than a single target. I mean, yes, your goal is a long-term decarbonization, but it's also about, and Stacey uses this term a lot, put one foot in front of the other every day, put one foot in front of the other. So yes, have a target, have a goal, but also don't be satisfied once you meet that goal. Keep going forward, be on a journey, and you can communicate that journey to your stakeholders, to your shareholders, and as long as your journey is credible, that also helps a lot, I think, in achieving whatever specific targets you're looking to achieve.
Absolutely. Amanda, I'd like to fire this over to you. How should companies and asset managers think about climate resilience differently?
Great question. I think there's really 5 things that we should look at as a business, as a company, as an asset manager, when it comes to thinking about the climate resilience and how we're planning for the future. And I think the first thing that we really need to look at is really setting scientific-based targets, quantitative targets that are across all our material emission scopes, and that includes material emissions from our supply chain. A lot of scope 3 emissions aren't really accounted for, so even in Australia's government targets, scope 3 emissions aren't really included in that. So setting comprehensive targets on that is really important. Outlining a strategy in order to deliver those targets and identify any enablers and disclose any quantifiable impacts that could impact your business. We should also be really looking at sector-specific commitments and actions that are aligned, like Lauren said, with a 1.5 degree decarbonisation pathway. Looking at our investments as well, I think is really important, and having targets that are aligned to that 1.5 degrees. So looking at how we're investing our capital expenditure on those. And then finally, I think really we need to start looking at the commitment to transparent disclosures and genuine, honest monitoring of what we're reporting on. It's really important. I think David mentioned that earlier. So those are the kind of 5 key things I would take away and think about.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm going to move over to Peter now. Aside from the national party delegations, who else from the government sector shows up and who doesn't? How is real action beyond goal setting being driven?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, another good question. It was really interesting at this COP. As far as countries participating, I think there were more country pavilions here. So countries sending delegations and setting up pavilions than any other COP. It's interesting though who they send from those delegations. I think a lot of them are net zero energy focused, not as much on the adaptation. It depended on the countries, of course. So some of the small island states, African countries had different mixes of representatives. But apart from that, what I'm definitely seeing, and we heard repeatedly in implementation labs and in discussions and meetings at COP, is it takes a very wide coalition to build these projects. So I'll give you an example of a couple. Probably one of the biggest initiatives was the African carbon markets. So you had the president of Kenya, Malawi, several other heads of states there, along with Rockefeller Foundation, Bezos Earth Fund, IKEA. So you got this mix of philanthropy, which is basically providing billions of dollars to de-risk projects with governments, with private sector. So it's just this mix of public and private sector that are there to drive action. And the other example I'll give it to is a really interesting announcement from Marsh McLellan Insurance, partnered with the Atlantic Council, who we work with, Agent Orange Center, a new way of doing projects and programs with a mix. So I'm seeing more of that. And then we do here at WSP, we do some work with an urban resilience fund, again with Pidge, Rockefeller, and some other sort of non-traditional type funders that are working with countries to implement projects.
Fantastic. Thank you for your thoughts, Peter. Very interesting. It was very nice to see that the presence of Africa there at the African COP. There was a lot of very interesting discussion there on the region. Tom, I'd like to fire this one over to you. So what are some of these potentially game-changing technologies and other innovations that were identified? What are we going to see coming through in the next few years?
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. As I mentioned in my remarks, certainly nature-based solutions were a big topic, and that doesn't mean either you do something green or it's gray, as we say, meaning steel or concrete. Oftentimes it's hybrid solutions between the green and the gray, and that's really becoming more and more mainstream. Electrification, whether it be energy, solar, wind, but also vehicle electrification, all types of vehicles, heavy trucks, even things like ships or airplanes are starting to be looked at. But where electrification maybe can't take you all the way there for the heavier uses, hydrogen. Huge discussions about hydrogen and how that gets woven into the toolbox of solutions. And carbon capture, direct carbon capture. I mentioned green carbon dioxide removal through planting trees or more sustainable farming that puts the carbon into the soil and into the vegetation rather than releasing it. But there's also commercially viable in the next couple decades, direct air capture and sequestration of carbon, large machines that will be developed and are already being pilot tested in many places, including in Canada and the US, and stored underground or otherwise stored in used oil reservoirs and other salt caverns, things like that. Really a big solution. And even things like fusion, which could be game changing, maybe is 25 years away still to be commercially scaled. But if it becomes real, would be a total game changer. And when you're talking about targets that are evolving to the end of the century, waiting 25 or 30 years for a game changing solution like fusion is not that outlandish to be thinking about. So really, really exciting, and lots of associated investment and business opportunities around all those things. And then of course, solutions too, software solutions, sustainability tools to help us do climate adaptation and resilience more efficiently, to measure it better, so that we're all reporting on the same kind of scorecard, if you will, keeping ourselves accountable. That was also a big technological discussion at COP.
And I think it's such an amazing time to upscale skills. I think we're never too old or late to learn new things, and that's something that's incredibly exciting, that there's so much work to be done and things to learn about and look forward to. So thank you so much for everyone's questions. Kendra, I'll hand it back to you as we're approaching the hour.
We are, and thank you very much for all of your responses. You've actually covered off quite a few of the questions that were submitted. Maybe we could pick up on one or two of them here, though, super quickly. One of them is very practical, and it picks up on something that was a point that was made earlier as far as how to actually action how to get to that temperature minimization, any practical KPIs or moves in that direction that you could, or the team can comment on. Over to you, Lawrence.
I'm glad that this question came up, because it allows me to also follow up on Tom's point. So there's a lot of really exciting big innovation happening, but there's also a lot of things that are ready now and available to us now. And one of the things that is critical to being on track to 1.5 degrees is reducing what they call so-called short-lived climate pollutants. I'm thinking particularly of methane, HFCs. Methane emissions have driven a very significant portion of warming to date. And there are a lot of very cost-effective reductions available in different sectors, in agriculture, in oil and gas, in the waste management sector, that, if implemented, will make a big difference. And why will they make a big difference beyond just their kind of CO2 equivalent, right, is that they're short-lived, so therefore they don't have as long a half-life in the atmosphere as CO2. So if you can reduce what's going into the atmosphere now of those short-lived pollutants, that actually their concentrations in the atmosphere will more rapidly stabilize and go down, and that would reduce climate forcing effects. So I think the science community is pretty unanimous that while we need to absolutely decarbonize over the long run, those short-term reductions, and particularly in those pollutants like methane HFCs, are critical to keeping on track to 1.5 degrees and not going over tipping points. And that is definitely something that a lot of people, I'm sure, on the call can look at in their own operations and think about, because methane's a pretty common pollutant, and so I definitely would encourage that as something to look at in the near term.
That's terrific. Thanks very much, Lawrence. And thank you very much to everybody for participating as panelists today and for everyone joining us on the call. The recording is going to be made available shortly, and we're going to make every effort to follow up on as many of those questions as possible. So thank you very much for submitting them. And I hope that everyone has a great rest of the week. Thank you very much for joining us.